The air inside Auberge Dorée smelled like money, not the crisp, clean kind, but the old, settled kind that had been accumulating for generations, soaking into the crown molding and the hand-stitched upholstery until it became indistinguishable from the place itself. Maren Solberg had worked the dinner floor for 3 years, and she still noticed it every time she pushed through the kitchen doors at 6 o'clock. Black truffle butter warming on the pass, burgundy decanting on the sideboard, the particular hush of a room where no one ever raised their voice because they had never needed to. The world had always bent toward them without being asked. She tied her apron strings in a double knot at the back, the way her mother had taught her, and picked up her section chart from the hostess stand. Table 4 was already occupied. Corporate party, 8 covers, reserved under the name Holbrook. She didn't know it yet, but that name was about to cost someone everything. The Holbrook table arrived in stages, the way powerful people always did. Each entrance calculated, each handshake a small performance of dominance. They were investment bankers, or at least 3 of them were. The others were the kind of adjacent professionals who orbit money without quite generating it themselves. A communications director, a legal counsel, someone from the Federal Regulatory Office whose exact role no one at the table seemed entirely certain of. Maren approached with water and the bread service, reciting the evening's specials with the particular economy of language she had trained herself into. Enough detail to convey expertise, not so much as to suggest she expected them to listen. The man at the head of the table was named Calloway Thorne. She knew this because the reservation had been made in his name, and because the others deferred to him the way people defer to someone who controls the room, without saying so. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of tan that comes from sailing rather than beaches, and he had the habit, she noticed immediately, of speaking about the people serving him as though they were not present. "Something sparkling for the table," he said, not to Maren but to no one in particular, as though the sparkling water would simply materialize. She poured it. Across from Thorne sat a woman named Ginevra Foss, the communications director. She had the careful look of someone who had spent years managing other people's mistakes and had grown quietly exhausted by it. She smiled at Maren. It was a real smile, the kind that reached the eyes, and Maren noted it the way she noted everything at that table. The legal counsel, a man named Percival Oakes, barely looked up from his phone, and then there was the man at Thorne's right hand. His name was Drummond Sy. She learned it from the way Thorne addressed him. Drummond, the Bordeaux, with the ease of someone who had been issuing instructions to this particular man for a very long time. Drummond Sy was perhaps 45, with a thin mouth and the kind of stillness that in some men reads as composure, and in others reads as coiled contempt. In Drummond Sy, it was the latter. He looked at Maren once when she set the bread basket down, and the look was not hostile. It was worse than hostile. It was the look of someone glancing at a piece of furniture. She had been looked at that way before. She had learned not to let it move through her face. The first course passed without incident. Maren worked her other tables, a quiet couple celebrating something, 2 women catching up over wine, a solitary man reading, and came back to the Holbrook party at intervals, refilling, clearing, adjusting. She was good at this, the orchestration of it, the way a good dinner service requires the kind of attention that looks like invisibility. It was during the second course that she first heard it. Drummond Sy leaned toward Thorne and said something in French, not the French of Montréal or of the South Shore, the French she had grown up hearing at her grandmother's kitchen table, but something older and more deliberate, a register she recognized from her 3rd year at McGill. from the literature seminars she had attended before her mother's diagnosis had pulled her out of school and deposited her, with shocking efficiency, into the working world. What he said, translated cleanly, was, "She's been hovering too long. Does she understand anything we're saying, or is she just another Anglophone in an apron?" Thorne smiled. He replied in the same register, something about how it didn't matter either way. Maren finished refilling the water at Ginevra Foss's glass and moved back toward the service station without changing her expression by a single degree. She understood every word. Here is what Maren Solberg had not told her employers at Auberge Doré, not because she was hiding it, but because it had never come up, and because the kind of person who lists academic credentials on a restaurant job application is the kind of person who makes their colleagues uncomfortable. She had, before her mother got sick, been 2 semesters away from completing a double major in French literature and linguistics at McGill. She had spent a summer in Lyon. She had written her 3rd-year thesis on the evolution of register and class markers in 19th century Quebecois correspondence, a topic that had required her to read, closely and repeatedly, the kind of formal French that well-educated men of a certain generation used when they wanted to say cruel things in polite company. Drummond Sai's French was excellent. It was also, she recognized, the French of someone who had learned it as a second language from a very good school. Technically precise, slightly performative, entirely unaware of its own limitations. She had set her mother's hospital bills on the kitchen table the week she withdrew from McGill. She had done the arithmetic 3 times, because the first 2 times the number had seemed impossible. It wasn't. She had taken the first service job she could find that paid enough to cover both rent and the medication co-pays, and she had been good at it, and she had stayed. That was 4 years ago. Her mother was in remission now, careful and quiet and grateful in the way people are when they have been genuinely frightened. Maren had been thinking, in the last few months, about going back. She had the credits, she just needed the money and the nerve in equal measure. She thought about this while she waited for the kitchen to finish the 3rd course, listening to the low percussion of pans and the French-Canadian invective of the sous-chef, and she did not think about Drummond Sai at all. The 3rd course arrived, and with it, the conversation at table 4 shifted. She noticed it first in the body language, the slight closing of the circle, the way Thorne angled his chair and Drummond Sai lowered his voice. The others at the table seemed to recede slightly, attending to their plates with renewed focus, the way people do when they understand that the real conversation is happening just beyond their participation. Maren moved through the table efficiently, setting plates, adjusting placement, asking about the preparation on the lamb. She took her time at the far end of the table because Percival Oakes, the legal counsel, wanted to know about the source, and because the far end of the table had excellent acoustics that ran directly along the wainscoting to the service station 4 feet away. She was not trying to listen. She had simply not stopped. Drummond Sai was speaking again in French, the same register, the same careful construction, but the subject had changed entirely. What he was describing, in the refined and slightly archaic French of his expensive education, was a transaction, a set of numbers that did not match another set of numbers, a regulatory filing that had been, as he put it, adjusted for clarity before submission. The name of a federal official who had been, as he put it, made comfortable with the outcome. Thorne was nodding, slowly, the way a man nods when he is hearing something confirmed rather than new. Ginevra Foss had stopped eating. Her fork rested against the edge of her plate at an angle that suggested she had put it down mid-motion and not picked it up again. Maren cleared a bread plate from the near end of the table. She did not look up. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Not panic, but something adjacent to it, a kind of heightened stillness, like the moment before a weather change when the air pressure drops and everything goes quiet. She returned to the service station and stood with her back to the room, making a minor adjustment to the napkin fold on a tray that did not need adjusting, and she recited to herself, in order, every phrase she had just heard. It was Drummond Sy who provided the final piece. He had been drinking steadily through the meal. Not obviously, not in the way that announces itself. But Maren had been refilling his glass, and she knew the pace of it. A man who drinks like that at a working dinner is a man who no longer thinks about who is in the room. After the dessert course, while the others were discussing something about a property development in the West End, Drummond Sy leaned back in his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man who has had a good meal and feels insulated by everything. Around him, the food, the wine, the quality of the room, the certainty that no one in a blue apron within earshot had the education to understand a word he'd said all evening. He spoke to Thorne, still in French, and what he said was essentially this, that the regulatory official, whose name was Whittaker, she recognized it. It had come up twice now, had been given assurances that extended beyond the current filing, that there were 2 more quarters of data that would require the same clarity. That Whittaker understood this and had been, again, made comfortable. And then, almost as a footnote, almost to himself, he said in French, "At least no one here speaks enough of the language to cause any trouble." Maren picked up the dessert plate from Ginevra Foss's place setting. She straightened. She looked at Drummond Sy directly for the first time all evening, and she said, in French, not his French, not the careful, constructed French of a second language speaker, but the French of her grandmother's kitchen and her McGill seminars, and a summer spent in Lyon arguing about Zola with people who took literature personally. "I wouldn't be so certain of that, Monsieur Sy, though I appreciate the confidence." The table went very quiet. Drummond Sy's face did something she had never seen a face do in quite that way. It did not go pale. It went blank, the way a screen goes blank when the power cuts, all the content evacuated at once, leaving nothing but the surface. Thorne set down his dessert fork. Ginevra Foss, at the far end of the table, exhaled. Maren held the dessert plate at her side and waited, because she had nothing else to say, and no particular need to fill the silence, and because her grandmother had once told her that the person who speaks first after a long pause has already lost. Drummond Sy spoke first. "You," he started, in English, and then stopped, as though the English sentence had run into something he hadn't anticipated. "Can I bring anyone coffee?" Maren asked. She addressed the whole table, pleasantly, in the same tone she used for everything. "We have a lovely single origin from the eastern townships tonight. Or tea, if you prefer." She did not go to her manager that night. She went home at 11:30, took the bus north toward her apartment near Park Extension, and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of reheated coffee and a notepad. She wrote down, in the order she had heard them, every phrase, every number, every name. She wrote down the time and the date and the table number. She wrote down Whittaker, and she wrote down adjusted for clarity, and she wrote down the phrase about 2 more quarters of data, because she had a good memory for language, and she had been paying attention all evening. Her mother called at midnight, the way she sometimes did when she couldn't sleep, and Maren talked to her for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. A show her mother had been watching, the garden, the neighbor's dog, and did not mention any of it. She looked up the name Whittaker the next morning, cross-referencing it with the federal regulatory body that Drummond Sy had been so carefully not naming. There were two Waitress. One was clearly too senior for what Sai had described. The other was a mid-level compliance officer whose appointment, she found in a brief news item from 3 years ago, had been supported by a consortium of investment firms that included, listed forth in a series of 7, the company whose name she had heard at table 4. She read the item twice. Then she called the tip line for the federal financial regulator. She had looked it up the night before. She had written the number below the notes on her pad, just below the phrase "made comfortable." The person who answered was professional and careful, and asked her to please hold while they transferred her to someone in the relevant department. She held. She drank her coffee. Through the window, the morning was grey and particular, the kind of grey that in Montreal in November has a texture to it, almost soft, the light coming in low and sideways off the river. She had a shift at 4 o'clock. She would go. 3 weeks later, Ginevra Foss came back to Auberge Doré alone. She asked for the section Maren was working. The hostess, who knew nothing about any of this and was simply matching a request to a table, seated her at a two-top near the window, and Maren came to take her order with a bread basket and a water carafe, and the same pleasantly neutral expression she brought to everything. Ginevra Foss looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I want you to know," she said in English, "that I didn't know the full extent of it. I suspected something, but I didn't know." Maren set the bread basket down. "The bouillabaisse is very good tonight," she said. "The chef does it differently in November. A bit less saffron, more of the fennel coming through. A lot of people prefer it." Ginevra Foss looked at her for another moment, and something moved through her face that was complicated and not entirely resolved. "I'd like the bouillabaisse," she said finally. "I'll put that in." Maren moved back toward the kitchen. Behind her, the dining room hummed with its usual low register of silverware and conversation, the amber light falling across the white tablecloths, the smell of the kitchen coming through in warm waves every time the pass door swung open. She had received a call the previous week from an investigator at the regulatory office, asking if she would be willing to provide a formal statement. She had said yes. She had also, in the same week, sent an email to the graduate admissions office at McGill asking about the process for re-enrollment as a returning student. She had not heard back yet. She expected she would. The kitchen was loud and bright and purposeful, the way it always was at 7 o'clock, and Maren Solberg pushed through the doors and called the bouillabaisse to the pass and went back to work, because there were 5 other tables in her section, and all of them needed something, and the evening was only just beginning.